Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to So Custom. So if you've been tuned in this past couple of weeks, you will know that I'm making a little Christmas gift set for a friend of mine. I've already made this makeup bag, this eye mask, and this is the third and final little gift in this set, my brush and jewellery roll. So if you're interested in seeing how I made it, then let's get started. Starting with the pattern, I've given myself a straight edge, and from there I'm measuring 14 inches, measuring down 8 inches, and then just squaring off to create a rectangle. So for this, I want to create 3 sections, so I'm measuring in 3.5 inches from each of the side seams towards the centre. The one on the left will be for jewellery, and on the right a little zip pocket, and of course the brush holder in the centre. So on the jewellery side, I want a little pouch at the bottom, so measuring up 3.5 inches and creating a little box. And then I want 2 holders, one for earrings and one for necklaces. So just creating 2 rectangles, the top one's about 1/2 inch wide and 3 inches long, and the bottom 1 inch wide and the same 3 inches long. So that's the jewellery side complete. Now for my zip pocket on the other side, I'm measuring down 1/2 inch from that top edge, giving myself a little dash line, and then for space to insert my zip, I'm measuring on each side of that line 3/8 of an inch. So that's my zip part done. Now all I need to do is to create the pattern piece for the brush holder, so just extending that 3.5 inch line on my pouch right across to the zip section. And now just labelling each of my sections. Adding a 1 centimetre seam allowance the whole way around, and for this piece I'm going to cut 1 in outer fabric and 1 in lining. And just like my previous videos, I've retraced this piece without the seam allowance. That's so I can cut out my structural pieces without adding any bulk to the seam lines. And then the last thing I've done off camera is just trace out each of my little individual pattern pieces. And on the brush holder itself, I've just added a little extra piece to the end that will just give me a little bit of extra room to create each section for each brush. So that's my pattern complete. Onto the fabric. If you've been watching this series, this will be no surprise to you. I'm refashioning both of these gorgeous silks. So this was from a kimono jacket I made last year. And then to add a bit of structure, I'm using some standard interfacing, the press-on type, and also this press-on foam. So this is going to give me the substance and sponginess, if that's a word, that I want for this jewellery and brush roll. You'll see how that looks later on. And on to the cutting out. Starting with the lining, I have 1 layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece, popping in a couple of pins to mark the position of my zip, replacing those pins with chalk marks, and then just so I know where each of my sections should go, I'm going to notch the edge of each of my lines. That's that done. So the first thing to do to this piece is to add that little bit of structure. So I'm adding the interfacing here, so just laying glue side down to wrong side of lining fabric and pressing into place. And now that that's done, I can start working on all the little pieces I need to add. So my pocket, my brush cover, my brush holder, my little pouch, all cut from lining fabric, and then my pieces for my earrings and necklace, cut from the outer fabric. So the first piece to add here is the pocket. I've also transferred the markings from my original pattern just to make it a little bit easier to sew. So I'm lining up the dots you seen me mark earlier and pinning into place. And stitching here right along that little rectangle using a tiny little stitch length. Trying to be as accurate as possible here at my corners. So that's that done. So now just to open up that center line. So I'm folding my fabric in half, matching up my edges, popping in a snip at the fold, and then cutting from there until I get to about an inch or so away from my corner and snipping from there at a diagonal into the corner. I'll do exactly the same thing on the other side. So that's how that looks. So pulling my pocket through to the wrong side and pressing out all of those edges. Happy with that. So now to add the zip. So laying it in underneath, pinning into place and ready to stitch. Using a little bit of a longer stitch length this time, taking it nice and easy over those zipper teeth at the corners. My zip all in place. So now to close up my pocket. So just matching that bottom edge up with the top, trimming away that excess zipper tape, pinning into place, and ready to stitch. So I'm only stitching here along the pocket edge. I'm not attaching it to the outer lining. Starting and finishing with a back stitch. So that's at a nice press, and that's my zip all in place and my pocket all closed up. Happy with that. So the next piece to add is my pouch on the jewellery side. So I'm just folding my fabric right sides together, and I'm just going to stitch down one edge, back stitching to start and to finish, sewing here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and that just needs a good press. And now the that that's done, it's ready to be added to the lining. So placing it right at my notch, making sure my edges are lined up, and pinning, and ready to stitch. Starting with a back stitch at the side seam, sewing at about half of my seam allowance across the bottom, and then when I get to my edge here, I'm just sewing as close as I can get to it, using that same longer stitch length as before, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's my pouch all attached. It's at a press, and now the next thing to add is the brush roll itself. So same thing as before, laying my fabric right sides together, but this time I'm going to sew down both of those short edges. So that's one done. I'll finish the other off camera. I've given it a press, and this is how it looks. Happy with that. And here, just lining it up again with that notch. Ready to stitch into place. Back stitching to start, sewing right along that edge, and back stitching to finish. So now that I have one side attached, I can start to form my little sections. So I'm starting with a large brush, popping it in underneath, creating that little section, and pinning into place. Ready to stitch, back stitching to start, trying to sew here as straight as possible, and back stitching to finish. And I'll do that one more time, using a bit of a smaller brush for this section, laying my fabric over the top and pinning into place. So that's the first two sections done. Happy with that. I'll complete the rest off camera, and this is how it looks. I did end up adding an extra little bit of fabric at the end there, probably a good 3 inches or so. And now just to finish off that bottom edge, so I'm just going to press that fabric down, creating little pleats, and pin into place. Stitching here within my seam allowance, back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. So that's my brush section all in place, and I'm very pleased with how this has turned out. So now I just need to add the brush cover. Again, doing exactly the same thing as before, laying my fabric right sides together and stitching along those short edges. So that's that ready to be added to the lining. So just laying it on top, lining up that top edge in between those notches, pinning into place, and ready to stitch. So that's the brush portion complete. Happy with that. And now the last things I need to add is just my earring and necklace pieces. And then to give a little bit of extra support, I've added interfacing just in the center of both. And now you've guessed it, I just need to sew up those side edges on both pieces. Starting with the earrings. That's one side done. And the other. And then the necklace piece. So I have a little bit of prep work to do here before I can add these pieces to my lining. And the first of which is to create some holes for my earrings to go through. So I'm just marking here about 1 inch in from either edge, right in the center at 1/2 inch intervals. I'm using my prim pliers here to punch holes right on those dots. And then to stop this fabric around those holes from fraying, I'm going to hand stitch some eyelets. And you can see here I've already stitched the first one. So for my second, the first thing I'm going to do is just pop some running stitches about 2 or 3 millimeters away from that punch hole the whole way around. So I'm using some embroidery thread. I've tied a knot in the end and I'm going in between the two fabrics, top and bottom, hiding my knot. And then, as I say, popping in running stitches in a circle the whole way around. So this is going to give me a bit of a template which will help me out when I come to sew my loops, which I'm going to do next. So that's my last running stitch. I'm going to pop my needle back up through the hole from underneath, place my thread on top, hold it with my thumb, and then go back in through the hole and come up through the fabric from below, making sure that my needle comes up in front of that thread I have under my thumb. And that's my first stitch done, so you can see that little loop. And I'm just going to repeat that the whole way around that little template circle. And then when I get to my last stitch, I'm just going to pop my needle down through the fabric again, just to the side of that last loop, and tie my threads off underneath. So that's my first 2 eyelets complete. I am very happy with these. I'll complete the other 2 off camera, which you can see here. And now I need to add some sort of closure to this piece so that I can easily add and take off my earrings. So I've decided on sew on snap fasteners, and off camera I've just hand stitched that into place. I've done exactly the same on my necklace piece, and now both of these are ready to be added to the lining. So I'm just matching them up with the notches you seen me snip earlier, pinning into place and ready to stitch. So just like all the pieces before, I'm stitching within my seam allowance. So that's those all attached, and now the very last thing I have to do here is just to finish those closures, marking the placement, and I'll sew those on off camera. Which you can see here. So that's all of my little compartments complete. Now for the outer fabric. one layer of fabric underneath my pattern piece. I've marked my notches off camera, and just like the lining before, the first thing to do here is to add that structure. This time, however, I'm adding the foam. So I've cut my foam into 4 sections. This is just going to help to give me that nice folded neat shape when this brush and jewellery roll is complete, which you'll see later on. And I've laid that foam on wrong side to wrong side and pressed it into place. I'll repeat that 3 more times for my other pieces. So that's that done. And the next thing to do is to take care of my ties. And for this case, I've decided on Rolo loops. So I've already made one, and for the second, I've just cut myself a strip of fabric. I'm folding it along its length, and I'm going to sew very close to that edge the whole way along. I'm using a tiny little stitch length here. So I just need to trim down that excess seam allowance, which I've went ahead and done off camera, and then using my loop turner to pull the whole thing through to the right side. And after it's all been pulled through and had a bit of a press, this is how it looks. And here, lining both ties up with the centre of the short edge and stitching into place. So now that that's done, I'm ready to join my outer and lining fabric together. So laying them wrong sides together and pinning along the outer edge and ready to stitch. So I just need to trim down that excess seam allowance again, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. And now to finish that raw edge, I've decided to use bias. So I've cut myself a strip of the lining fabric on the bias. I folded in one end and pressed, and I'm just laying that right at the centre of the top and stitching the whole way around. And when I come back to my starting position, I'm just laying that bias over the top of the folded edge and running a few more stitches over to finish. I'll trim that excess bias, press it away from the lining, and then from the outside fold that raw edge into the centre, giving myself a nice crease line there and folding it on top. I'll finish that pressing off camera and pin that into place and ready to stitch. So back to that longer stitch length again, and I'm taking this really gently. I want to try and be as neat as possible here. Sewing right along that inner crease edge the whole way around and finishing with a back stitch. So that just needs a final press, which you can see I've went ahead and done here. So super happy with this. And then I just have one last thing I want to do, and that is just to add these little gold cubes just to hide the knot at the bottom of the ties. And with that addition, my brush and jewellery roll is complete. So now for the fun bit, adding the contents. Super practical, gorgeous little case. I love it. And you can see here just how adding that sponge in 4 sections gives a nice neat fold to this case. I'm super happy with how this little set has turned out. I learned loads making this, and hopefully my friend will really enjoy this gift. I hope you guys enjoyed watching the process and found it useful. If you did, give this video a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do. And I will see you guys when normal service will resume next week. Until then, I hope you have a fabulous week. Bye, folks.